All right, welcome everyone to this webinar with Helena Norberg-Hodge and Michael Shuman. My name is Sean. I work with Helena at Local Futures. Thanks so much for joining us. I just want to make sure everyone can hear me. If you can hear me, could you type in the chat box yes, just to let me know? Awesome, a lot of yeses. That is great. You're all automatically on mute right now, just so we can avoid any background noise, but I just want to let you know that there will be an opportunity for all of you to join in the conversation about halfway through the webinar. And at that point, I can unmute you and you can ask questions for our presenters. So I'll start by just briefly mentioning or briefly introducing Helena and Michael. Helena is the director of Local Futures and author of Ancient Futures and Local is Our Future, and producer of the film The Economics of Happiness. And Michael Shuman, for those of you who don't know him, is a local economy visionary, an expert on a range of topics ranging from community economics to local finance and local investing. And I see someone asking about video. I think Helena has her video off for the moment, but she'll turn it on soon. And my video is not working. Otherwise, you'd be able to see me too. So just to give an overview of the plan for this webinar, we're going to give each of our speakers about 20 minutes to present and then move to questions from all of you. If you have a question, please type it in the chat box at any point, and at the end, I'll read it out for Helena and Michael to answer. You can also choose to ask your question over audio, and you can use the raise hand feature, which should be at the bottom of your screen, to let me know that you're interested in asking your question out loud. And just a brief note that if you want to make sure that your chat message can be seen by everyone here, you have to make sure you're sending it to everyone in meeting instead of all panelists. It's just one of the quirks of Zoom. So I know that some of you might not be able to stay for the full hour and a half, so I just wanted to share with you the next step from this webinar, which we would love for you to take, which would be joining the International Alliance for Localization, which is a cross-cultural network of activists and individuals and organizations, basically anyone who's interested in localizing economies and who wants to connect with others who are doing that around the world. So you can carry on the discussion after this webinar through the IAL listserv and Facebook group. And I'll post a link in the chat for the page you can go to sign up for the IAL. We also just launched a Voices from the IAL video project, and we're hoping the end result of that will be a compilation of short 2-minute videos from members of the International Alliance for Localization, talking about what going local means to you and what the importance of local economies is for you personally. So if you wanted to contribute to that project, that would be awesome. Without further ado then, I'll hand things over to Helena and Michael. And I guess we could start by talking a bit about what are some of the assumptions about the way our economic and financial systems work that are being called into question by the coronavirus pandemic, and what are some of the things that need to change after the pandemic is over, and we'll go from there. And Helena, I don't know, I think you're still muted, so.
Yeah, I want to thank my dear friend and colleague, Michael, for joining us. And really, he is the world's expert on local financing. And local financing is a fundamental, essential cornerstone of creating healthy, sane, workable economies. So Michael, please start by giving us an overview and also how that relates to an economics of happiness. But I'll focus on the happiness part and you can focus more on the economics part.
Yep, no, my pleasure. Even in these dark times, it's nice to connect with friends and see opportunities and seize them if we can. I've been doing a lot of blogging in the last month, trying to find little pathways of hope. And those of you who want to read more, you can go to michaelhschuman.com. And I'll say that I think the most fundamental assumption of economic development over the last 200 years has been shattered by this pandemic. And what I mean is the theory of comparative advantage. So those of you who have studied any economics from David Ricardo know that the theory of comparative advantage says, well, you know, you should think of a world economy and your place should figure out how to become the world's greatest producer in one thing. And everything else, it makes more sense, it's more efficient for you to import. And honestly, I think most communities have embraced this theory of comparative advantage and they base their economic development around it. And we've created a world of communities that are highly vulnerable to events outside their control. And I think this pandemic has been a reminder that an economy that is not self-reliant on basics, by basics I mean things like food, energy, water, finance, healthcare, if you can't provide these things for yourself and a pandemic comes in, you are a goner. And I feel like that is the situation many communities find themselves in now. And we really have to come up with a fundamentally different way of thinking about economics and economic development if we're going to go forward. And I think resilience has to be at the core, and resilience defined as, you know, meeting our basic needs and also meeting threats that might come to undercut our basic needs, that we have connections with other communities in the world who can come to our assistance if we need further help. So a world of self-reliant or relatively self-reliant communities is going to be a much more resilient world and also a more prosperous world, and a world I think we'll all want to live in. And I think those of us on this call have, in our own ways, been working on this quest for the last 2 decades. Some of us on local energy, some on local food, some on community banking or crowdfunding. And all of these things, I think, are going to be necessary. But on top of this, I think our own communities are going to be in extreme pain as if a hurricane or a tornado hit. And that's going to be the reality for the next few months, because there's going to be such devastation from the downturn in our economy, the numbers of people who will be unemployed, the deficits and the difficulty that our local and state and provincial and national governments will have to do recovery. And so I think it really behooves us to be prepared to share with these leaders, these policymakers, some new ideas for reconstruction. So I wrote a piece about a week ago called 12 Asks for US Governors. I'm going to just share some of these asks, but in a more general way that is relevant for the many of you who do not live in the United States, but for whom these sort of big picture policy asks are still going to be relevant. And I think I would put them in 6 categories. The first category is to fundamentally overhaul economic development. And I would say at the heart of economic development has been what you might call attract and retain economics. That is, that communities are called upon, encouraged to put money on the table to attract global companies who provide jobs, or put money on the table to hold on to companies that might go elsewhere. And that's part of the game of globalization. And of course, that whole philosophy of economic development ignores the fact that most of a healthy economy is going to be local business that will never be involved in that game. And I think we are called upon to say to our leaders, the time for this wasteful form of economic development is completely over. We need that money to nurture, to support, to expand our local businesses in the name of self-reliance and resilience. And if we could generalize this a little bit, one way to think about the attract and retain game in economic development is that it's a form of corporate subsidization. And I know that Helena will speak to this when she speaks, but really a lot of what has fueled globalization and this elimination of our self-reliance has been subsidies for big global companies, big banks, big oil, big cattle, big water, big energy, big nuclear power. And desubsidizing all of this stuff is critical for us taking those resources and focusing them laser-like on the growth and health of our local business sectors so that we can achieve a world of self-reliant communities. The second piece is procurement. Procurement refers to the act of large institutions, but in this case, we'll talk about local and state and provincial governments, these entities buying goods and services. And the way that we have structured the procurement game is that we put out a request for proposals, and those that are supposedly the cheapest, the lowest bid, get the project. The problem with this is that the way we count costs and benefits is not coherent. Because, for example, if you take a bid from a local supplier, say you wanted to provide school lunches at your public schools, and you get a bid from a local supplier, well, that local supplier is going to have relationships with local farmers and will spend the money in many ways in the community, and that generates jobs and income and tax money that goes back into the local government. Now, somehow that bid should take into account all of those benefits. In contrast, if you have a non-local bidder that maybe has a cheaper bid, but they're supporting farmers and suppliers that have nothing to do with your community, and there's no additional tax dollars coming into your community, that bid should somehow be given a demerit for that. But our procurement systems do none of this now. That means that they are systematically advantaging bids irrationally to non-local bidders. And if we could get that money to go back into local bidders, it would be an amazing stimulus for rebuilding our economy and rebuilding resilience. The third piece is taxation. Now, I believe that in most of our countries, we may have to give a tax holiday to small businesses over the next 6 months or a year for them to survive. And I think that's not a bad idea. But what is more important in the long away from taxes on things we don't want, which is carbon consumption, pollution, energy use. And if we can put these things these things into the tax system, all of us will be better off, and we will generate all the tax money we need in an environmentally and resilience-friendly way. The fourth policy issue has to do with local currency. And those of you who have heard me over many years know that I am not a gaga fan of local currencies because I feel that many of them are too small, too symbolic to really shift the economy. Properly, it can and should be like Philadelphia that partially paid their civil servants and teachers in the local currency and partially collected taxes in the local currency. What we learned is that when you bring the local government in, it fundamentally legitimates and increases the use of this kind of currency, and it can become a major stimulus on the local multiplier. And the kind of policy change that we're going to need, I think in some countries we're going to need to permit local governments to issue and do transactions in this currency. And in some, probably in all local governments, we're going to have to convince them that this is a good idea. The fourth thing I want to mention is public reinvestment. So there are a bunch of Americans on the line right now. They're aware of the Bank of North Dakota. It serves many functions, and the Bank of North Dakota is the only publicly owned state bank in the United States. It was formed a little more than 100 years ago, and one of the great things that it does is it takes money that comes to the state from the federal government, what are called transfer payments, and it takes money that it collects from taxpayers in North Dakota. And before that money is spent, it has to be put on deposit somewhere. So in most places around the world, communities, local governments happily go to Bank of America, Citicorp, and they put that money into international securities, and it does absolutely no good for the local economy. In the case of North Dakota, they put that money on deposit in local banks and credit unions, which increases the ability of those institutions to lend to local businesses. So again, this is a real stimulating kind of shift in public policy. And if we could get more and more governments to shift where they deposit their money prior to using it and putting that to use in the local economy, that will be an enormous plus in moving us toward resilience. So the last policy, number 6, has to do with local investment. And this, I think, is absolutely central, because one of the biggest subsidies all over the planet that we provide to global business is that all of us, including I would bet most of us on this phone call, are systematically over-investing our life savings, perhaps in pension funds, perhaps for our kids' education, perhaps for some emergency, but we've over-invested in global companies and under-invested in local business and other local priorities. And that needs to change. One of the reasons this has happened is that there are laws in every country that systematically tilt the playing field against local businesses. They make it expensive for them to raise capital, whether loans or stock or royalty. They make it difficult for them to raise capital from the 99% of us who are sort of grassroots investors. We've changed some of this in the last 10 years. And interestingly, a lot of these changes were kicked off by the last financial crisis. And in the United States, in Canada, in much of Europe and Australia, there are now crowdfunding laws that make it cheaper and easier for grassroots investors to put money into local business. But there's so much more that we need to do. We need to educate investors and businesses how to seize these opportunities that are becoming available. We have to make it easier to create local investment funds like they've done in Nova Scotia. And we have to also create tax incentives as they've done in New Brunswick. So New Brunswick has a 50% provincial tax credit that it gives for every dollar residents there put into local business in the way of investment. Those are the kinds of big picture changes that if we can start feeding our capital, our savings, into the local businesses we care about, this could make our transition to resilience and self-reliance really possible. So let me stop there and pass it over to my good friend, Helena.
Actually, I'd love you to also add what you wrote in that article for me recently about how you started getting interested in local investment, because I think it's really interesting for people to think of this simple idea that by reaching out to some friends, it can be a win-win strategy for both of us. It's like a perfect mini example of what we could actually all start doing right now, and it would be legal.
So I'll mention this. This is, I wrote an article that Helena is co-editing for a magazine in Australia called Dumbo Feather. And
it's all on localization, yeah.
And this marks year number 12 since I was a divorced man. And there were many good things that happened then, but if you count the years, I got divorced during the last financial crisis, which is not an ideal time for doing this. And to make a long story short, I wound up in tremendous debt as a result of this. And it really took me a number of years to figure out how I could get out of this. And really much of that debt appeared on credit cards that I was paying something like 15 to 25% annual interest. And what I ultimately figured out is that all this advocacy I was doing on crowdfunding to help small businesses, I could use for myself. So I basically convinced 5 dear friends, local friends, to pick up pieces of my credit card debt. And rather than paying the credit card companies 15 to 25%, I was paying my friends over 5 years 5%. I have since paid them all back, and I wound up saving myself $75,000 in interest. So to me, crowdfunding is not just about saving small businesses, it's about saving your friends and your family. It's helping your kids get out of debt. It's helping a neighbor get a new house. It's helping someone in your community build a solar energy system in their block. So there's so much that can be done with these new investment tools.
And also, Michael, don't forget that your friends actually got higher interest than they would have got in the bank.
That's right, because they were getting 1 or 2% in the bank.
On both sides.
Yep.
And that's also why it's so exciting now that there are these local funds where groups are beginning to put money into a pot to support their local businesses, their local friends, their local neighbors. And this is also why we call it the economics of happiness, because it is absolutely fundamental to rebuilding the fabric of community, the fabric of human scale interdependence, which is how we evolved. We are actually needy people, naturally, needy of love, acceptance, connection. And very often we've ended up in this alley, this rather, single issue alley where many spiritual traditions we think are teaching us, oh no, you shouldn't need anyone. You just look inside and be by yourself, and that's all you need. No, we evolved, and every single child that is born, that grew up in a community fabric where that child was seen and heard and formed an identity shaped on much closer human connections, those children end up with a much deeper sense of self-esteem. And what that means also, much greater confidence to be themselves, who they really are. When you go down a path that is essentially an economic path, where you become pitted against people around you from kindergarten onwards, because we're rearing our children in a type of factory farming. It's not natural to segregate children into separate age groups. It's absolutely unnatural, and it creates this complete sense of elbows and competition. So I often give the example of, in the kindergarten you have 31-year-olds. Now, they cannot help each other to walk. Impossible. It just becomes elbows and screaming, and then you maybe have one adult there trying to keep order. What I experienced, and as many of you may know, I came from, my eyes were open to all of this from deep experiences in traditional indigenous cultures. And there I realized that never, ever were children segregated in that way. Never. So the entire life was one where you were relating the 1-year-old to the 3-year-old, and the 3-year-old instinctively lent out a hand to help the 1-year-old to walk. Well, when they were 5 and 8 and 10 and 80 and interacting with each other, what you saw was this pattern of constant learning and teaching and being useful and connected for your whole life. I know that it may sound too idealistic, too far off in the future, but I am just so thrilled to have been part of pioneering these localization initiatives around the world and seeing that you are actually beginning to form those deeper relationships when you start, particularly, the classic example we like to use is when a mother takes her child shopping in the farmer's market compared to the supermarket. In most of these farmers markets, you are talking about that intergenerational connection. You're talking about an atmosphere where people actually take the time to shop. We've done studies. It turns out they have 10 times as many conversations in the farmers market as they do in the supermarket. Where in the supermarket, very often, the sugary things are targeting the child is screaming for, I want this, I want that, and you just rush in and out. Very dehumanizing. So these are a few examples. Michael's experience with being able to pay much less debt, and the people who were lending the money getting higher interest at the practical financial economic level by essentially cutting out giant middlemen. And these giant middlemen are not evil people. They aren't people. These giant middlemen are institutions. They're like huge empires. Within those empires, the people who work may be no more greedy, no more, in any way nasty than the small farmer or the small shopkeeper or the local bank manager. Not really different as people, but the fact is that there are structural, institutional paths that can take us towards much greater collaboration and reduce a path that is fundamentally, move away from a path that's fundamentally about competition. This competition, which I saw again, very clearly in traditional cultures. It starts already with some of the fundamentals in schooling. We need to make changes to schooling. They are being made in many alternative schools around the world. And many of you will have heard of Steiner schools or Waldorf schools. There are many other models where parents recognize there's something fundamentally wrong in our school system. And it's becoming clearer and clearer because that path is fundamentally becoming more and more competitive, more and more speedy, pushing our children in a direction that is also, particularly with teenagers and a little bit older, leading to epidemics of anxiety, depression, and even suicide. So there is that questioning, and from the bottom up, usually individuals in their local communities taking initiatives are developing alternative models. Many of them also include helping children to learn the joy of growing food, to actually learn some practical skills that are going to be very useful in the future. But then this path that is so competitive is a path that is geared to a particular type of economic activity. And as Michael said, from the outset, comparative advantage was telling every region, every country, no, don't produce a diversity of things that you need. You specialize in what you're good at and export it. Now, we do need to look at the fact that this started at the same time as slavery, literally slavery, which was not asking people to move away from self-reliance and produce for export. It was forcing them. And it included genocide of most indigenous people in virtually every part of the world were either exterminated or almost exterminated because they didn't comply with that recipe, that economic recipe. And of course, as you moved on to, in the early days, it was particularly in farming, huge cotton plantations, huge tea plantations, or whatever, the work was slave-like. So later on, when fossil fuels, which were supposedly cheap, pushed in by often idealistic people, pushed in a techno path where people were replaced with machinery and lots of oil, lots of energy, then that really looked like progress, because standing in a field working like a machine all day is not something anyone wants to do. So let the machines do it, wonderful. What happened then is that we had mass exoduses to the city. So the whole economic formula was leading to this concentration in big industrial cities, where at first the industrial production was the livelihood for most people. But in the last 30 years, in the era of globalization, what's happened is that in the industrialized countries, those jobs were shifted to so-called poor countries. And we supposedly became great participants, or rather participants in this great new information service economy. We didn't have to do this dirty, heavy work of, digging in the ground. And the propaganda was that you can go back to the land. And there had been a massive movement to say, we want to go back to the land. We want to have community. We don't want to be living in high-rise buildings, no contact with one another, no contact with the earth. So there was this huge mandate in the 70s and up to the sort of 80s from a very large section of the population to go back to the land. And in came this promise of computers, a new information society, clean and easy. We didn't realize that what was actually happening was that the world was being made much dirtier, because large industries were moving to China, to India, to Indonesia, to Mexico. And as they moved, they were also starting to produce, like a t-shirt would be produced on 3 continents. An apple juice tin I remember, and I've been raising awareness about this for 40 years, and I remember 30 years ago someone saying, oh, Helena, you're right. I was served apple juice on a United Airlines flight, and actually it said on the little tin, apples from 5 countries, and they included Argentina and Hungary. So the production for the giant global players was now a complete free playing field. Anywhere they wanted to go, they could go, and they could transport things massively back and forth, no regulations. And this is why it's really important that we do look at the free trade treaties when we discuss the choice we now have after this pandemic. Do we want to continue to go in a more globalizing path, down a more globalizing path, or towards systemic localization? Localization is not an end station. It is not about every last economic activity happening at some absolute scale of 10 people, a tiny village. No, localization is happening in big cities. It's happening as people understand the need to build different economic relationships that are place-based, in that sense, localized. And they want to be able to deal with players, businesses, banks that belong to a place, that are accountable and visible, and that will adhere to rules set by society, a democratic process. In the beginning now, as we had this growing localization movement around the world, these regulations for businesses are not yet being shaped by the broad ecological mandate we have to reduce energy wherever possible, to make sure that technology is in the service of human beings, of human society. I really believe that our biggest problem is that the system on which we depend, and it's fundamentally a techno-economic system, has become so big and so far removed and so spread out across the world that we don't see it. And this, for us, is the big challenge. Big picture activism. Waking up to the big picture in order to be part of a chorus of voices demanding that we shift economic activity into sight, into place, and that the first station is the nation state. We don't want businesses to be able to roam the world and blackmail our governments by saying, if you don't keep your labor prices low, if you don't provide lots of cheap energy, if you don't remove all regulations that protect the environment and that protect people, we will go elsewhere. And this blackmailing, as I say, it's not about evil people. It's about people trapped in a path, an economic fundamentalism that goes back 200 years, as Michael said. The idea that comparative advantage means a more and more global trade and growth through supporting the global traders, the global banks. Now, in supporting them, government, so that within the businesses, the people who are there, we have to remember, the head of Exxon was running and running and running to try to stay on top when there was a merger with Mobil. Now, at every level, you're in this rat race. I just see this, this snake chasing its tail out of blindness, getting bigger and bigger and faster and faster. If we don't wake up, ordinary citizens, particularly the environmentalists, the social activists, who are giving so much of their life to make the world a better place, we are the ones that have to change this. Inside, on the hot seat, in government, in big business, let's not expect that they're going to stop and take the time to wake up. Not even now in this pandemic. In this pandemic, some of us have a bit of time, I hope, and not just hope, I am sure there are enough of us who can become voices for clarity about not continuing down a global techno-economic path and supporting a shift towards more human scale, shortening distances, slowing down. It takes time to nurture, to love, to care. Every single thing that lives today needs to be rescued, needs to be nurtured, needs to be taken out of the prison-like structures that have kept us running faster and faster in this competitive direction, always using more energy, very often for no reason at all, except corporate profit. Why do we have windows that you can't open, and then you have to have air conditioning in trains and boats and public spaces? Why, when you do open the windows, does it have to be done electronically? Can't we use our hands even for that? We didn't ask for this. We didn't drive this system. We didn't ask to have our industries move to China. In fact, there were many labor unions and groups that tried to protect their jobs, but it was painted as nationalistic, as selfish, and we were told, oh, we're going to be raising the standard of living in these countries. Go to those countries and you will see people running faster and faster. You will see suicide and depression on the increase. We must open up our eyes to the real indicators. What makes human beings happy? What makes them healthy? And of course, the deep understanding that nature is us. We are nature is the better way to put it. Nature is not us. She can do without us. Mother Earth can do fine without us, but we are nothing without her. Every breath of, in our lungs, every sip of water, it's just, we of course are waking up to the fact that the health of nature, the thriving of nature is inextricably linked to our thriving. And there is this path, there is this paradigm, first of all, and a structural path, specific, clear agendas. And, fundamentally, we're looking at shifting taxes, subsidies, and regulations to stimulate and support the caring, the deep, truly the economics of happiness. I think I've gone on too long already, probably. So I will, what do I have? Sean, do I have another few minutes?
If you wanted to take another minute, that would be fine, but we should move to questions soon.
Okay, so I think maybe one of the most important points I want to make is that for us, it's so tragic on the one side to see how many people are now feeling this deep guilt because they're being told that climate change is continuing and we're having this ever more dramatic effect. In Australia, where I am now, the fires recently were, a real eye-opener and absolutely heartbreaking. But for me, the most heartbreaking thing is that people as individual consumers are being blamed. In the entire climate movement, there is virtually no mention of the way that our governments have worked with big industries to massively increase emissions, talking only about don't drive your car, don't go on holiday. And then now the discourse, even from the environmental movement, has been, oh, people are just, they don't learn from information. They just don't learn. They don't care. They want to hold on to their lifestyle. People are not holding on to their lifestyle. A lot of people are maybe not having enough time to think about climate because they are struggling to pay the rent. Even the middle classes are working harder and faster than ever before to put food on the table, to pay for the rent. Now, we must wake up to the economic trajectory and to remove that absolutely false blame on the individual, many of whom now are literally saying, the human race is like a cancer. We deserve to extinguish ourselves. What's wrong with human beings? It's not human beings that are at fault. It's inhuman scale structures. It's blindness. Our humanity, our hearts, our souls are a good compass for telling us what we are and what we want. And we want more connection with the earth. We want more collaborative relationships with other people. We thrive when we have that. We have evidence of that from traditional, ancient, indigenous cultures. We have evidence for that from the new localization movement that miraculously has managed to demonstrate and create literally millions of examples around the world, but still small and under the radar of the mainstream media. Once you open up your eyes to this, you can remove the self-blame, and in fact, you can remove blame altogether. We've all been on this path blindly. People at the top, people at the bottom. Let's wake up, look at the big picture, and embrace what is truly a human path, what is truly one where technology will be in the service of human scale and human eyes and responsibility, accountable, visible. Beware of 5G and robots. It's taken a giant leap in the opposite direction. Let's look at where we are already demonstrating how well things work. How many projects where people are enjoying farming because it's small scale diversified farming? How many projects where people are getting involved in house building because it's natural materials, it's intergenerational collaboration? Look to the permaculture movement for many examples. Look at the local energy schemes. And as I said, this is not just small, small, small. It's not just in villages. It's happening in cities. Small can multiply and replicate and become the biggest, most powerful force. You know, remember the analogy of the elephant versus the mosquitoes. Let's become lots of noisy mosquitoes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helena. So we're going to open it up to questions now. We've already had a lot of good ones come in the chat, and thanks, Michael, for responding to some of them there. I also just want to mention again that if you'd like to ask your question out loud, you can raise your hand. There should be a raise hand button at the bottom of your Zoom, and I'll see it, and then I'll probably jump back and forth between reading out the written questions and calling on some people to ask audio questions.
And could we also say that we love to hear where you're from, because it's so exciting to see this global community. Building local community does not preclude global community, but we have to be careful that global community doesn't replace and destroy local community, which is the foundation.
Absolutely. So I'll start with a topic that came up in the chat, which Michael briefly responded to, but it would be good to talk about more, which is a question about being able to pay for things like rent and utilities and needs like that, inside a local food economy. And Michael briefly mentioned that local food is actually often cheaper than non-local food when subsidies for non-local food are removed. But could both of you talk some more about that?
Well, I think that the spirit of the question is that if we move to a total barter economy and you still face basic needs that are only available through cash, you're kind of lost. And yeah, I mean, I think that this is why we need to reinvent an economy in the modern world. It may have cash, it may be based a little bit on national money and a little bit on local money and a little bit on other things in between. So I don't think we need to take apart the economy completely and go to a subsistence barter economy, but barter is sometimes really useful. And I think some small communities in particular around the world, once this crisis is done, are going to need some really fundamental new approaches to put people back to work. And I think looking, in a way, becoming aware of what local needs are, and whether it's barter or use of time dollars or use of local currency or use of some other kind of money. Getting that economy moving is going to be really important. But I think Helena's point, which I also want to highlight, is that we can't keep doing all of the same things we did before. You may have loved being able to go to the supermarket and buy lots of things from long distances that were not seasonal, traveled many miles and contributed to carbon footprints. We may need to, reshape the way that we eat, the way that we think about eating, in order to localize more of what we do. And I think the same thing is true about energy. The same thing is true about finance, the way we organize our savings, the way we organize our investment. All of these things need to be rethought to put our communities back to work.
And also I want to say that we found that actually the local food initiatives, which we have been pioneering in many parts of the world, including America, starting in the early 90s, or even earlier actually. But what we found is that generally speaking, they are working using the national currency. And that what is so wonderful about it is that even using the national currency, what's being set up is that closer relationship between farmers and consumers, which means that it could be converted, if necessary, to bartering or to a local currency. But I do want to say that right now, I actually would probably be even less enthusiastic than you, Michael, about local currencies until now. I mean, maybe now there is such a readiness. But our friend George Ferguson, who's mayor of Bristol in the UK, he brought in a local currency too, and people were able to pay part of the local tax and so on. His salary was paid 100% local currency, but it hasn't really taken off. So I think I would probably urge most people to look at and be aware of the fact that you can use the national currency and do amazing things, whether it's like Michael's, a new type of banking, which can happen on a very small human scale. You could right now get together with 10 friends and say, Michael only needed 5, you might need more to help you get out of this dependence on a big bank that's sucking wealth out of you and your local community and your nation state. The nation states are getting impoverished by a system that is also essentially built on make-believe money at the top. It's not backed by wealth. It's backed by the idea that by our ignorance, the ignorance that allows this craziness to continue. So anyway, yeah.
Can I add one thing, Helena?
Yeah, sure.
I think that I try to imagine what this crisis would be like if there hadn't been a local food movement over the last 25 years. Because I feel like one of the success stories, it hasn't been successful everywhere, and there's certainly lots of food shortages around the world. But boy, I mean, the fact that many markets and many food supply chains have stayed open, I think, owes to the fact that over the last 25 years, despite lots of opposition from the food industry, we have localized supplies.
Yeah.
And I think it's a lesson that we need to go further and faster.
And it's one that please help us get this message out, because I have to say, even today, to start a new farmers market or a new initiative that will link it is difficult, because often even the farmers are still so affected by the dominant rhetoric, believe in the biggest better. And then, by the way, this movement has been created by women, grassroots women around the world. And I've been one of them. So when I came to Australia 20 years ago and tried to get farmers markets started and sell the idea, I was told, oh, it's never going to happen in Australia, Helena. The farms are all gigantic, it won't happen. And now there is a thriving local food movement. And I was so thrilled that last year, a woman from Detroit, which is a place that we featured in our film, The Economics of Happiness, where poor people left behind as industry just abandoned the city and most wealthy, middle class people has left the city. So poor people, primarily Afro-American, they were there and they created these wonderful local food initiatives. And last year there was a woman from Detroit teaching people in the local government in Sydney how to set up effective local food hubs. So this is also part of what we are trying to make clear, is that localization promoted from a global perspective and for global prosperity and for global, based on global collaboration, exchange of information, is a fundamental part of it. I don't know if
All right.
there's a question or not.
Yeah, I apologize in advance if we don't get to your question. We'll try to get through as many as we can before.
I'll try to be quick. Yeah.
Not to worry. It's all important to hear. So I'm going to combine a few questions in one here, because we've had a few come in on the theme of what is the role of technology in the localization movement. I imagine that's on a lot of our minds right now, since we're doing this online and so much of our lives have moved online, at least temporarily. So how can we combine, one question was, how can we combine contact of the earth with online usage and development of businesses? That was from Vanya. And another question was, what do you think about the role of cryptocurrency right now? And then finally, this question is from Mishka in California, who is asking, do you think that technology should be dialed back only to the pre-industrial level, since technology will always be used to exploit? So generally, what are your thoughts on how technology intersects with localization?
I imagine that Michael and I might differ a little bit here. And my thinking comes so much from having lived half the time for 45 years now in the very, very traditional cultures like in Bhutan and Ladakh, especially where there was virtually none of what we call technology. They had technologies and I love them, they were wonderful. And there was a very clear path where those technologies could be improved, or where solar energy and decentralized renewable energy could provide almost everything that people really want. A bit of heating, glass in the windows, and so I think if we actually looked at energy use and technology from the point of view, what would actually, for the entire global population, mean certain improvements in the standard of living that most people would want, I think we would get a very different picture. Where we are now in industrial society, we are obviously happily making use now of the internet and of this sophisticated technology called Zoom. However, I am really passionately convinced that we need to prevent an escalation, like I said, into 5G. And that part of the way we want to use these communication technologies, including the mobile phone, is to communicate a vision, a path that will take us closer to the earth, and that will mean gradually a reduction in our dependence on those technologies. Now, this part of this means we've got to look at this from a bigger picture. We have seen very clearly from our point of view that when we go down the technological path, we are actually running after the machines. We are being made to behave in an inhuman way. When the secretary or the person who was typing letters was getting the letters by post and posting whatever she or they were typing, they operated at a pace which meant they were thrilled when there were 20 letters in the post. I mean, I remember this so well. It was like really exciting to get lots of letters. Now, as you get hundreds of emails in your inbox, you feel like you're going crazy. We do not realize that this speed and overabundance of information is actually making us more stupid. It's making us less healthy. It's making us less intelligent, because the important things in life that would allow us as a society to genuinely now nurture from the bottom up the real economy. The real economy is the people and the earth. that together provide what we need. If we want to really care for those people and care for every plant, for every tree, for every drop of water, which we have a mandate to do on a crowded planet, we have a mandate to make careful use and with love and deep compassion and empathy. We don't do that long distance. The computer is not helping us to create a responsible, compassionate, wise economy. You can sit in New York and you can send an order to your subsidiary in Indonesia to clear cut every tree. When you think that you can do that effectively by sending a message saying, plant a forest for me overnight, well, you're an idiot. Now that's what's happening in carbon trading, what's going on, that's absolute, plantation monocultures, toxic, planted by airplanes dropping things. Well, we need to be more in touch with what's happening on the ground. And I think then we'll understand that we need to use the technologies we have. And obviously now we need our satellite and very sophisticated tools to monitor climate, to make, to be there for catastrophe, help, real support, also perhaps for monitoring to ensure that we're moving in the right direction. But this needs to be negotiated through treaties involving the environmental and social movements at the side of our governments to come together and there to look at the use of technology in a meaningful way for protection, for really meaningful use. But for the actual economic activity, let's start looking at a path where we reduce our dependence. And it's going to be gradual. In many local communities right now, they assume that the only way to get a local food thing going is through some new app or only over the internet. It's not. Lots of things are still happening by putting up leaflets or using the phone or talking to people. Let's not move too rapidly into the assumption that we can only function through the mediation of technology. Sorry, it's a very important issue, and I think we will be doing a webinar at some point just on technology. Michael.
So I won't disagree with hardly anything you said, because I wrote a book on technology about 20 years ago, and I mean, to me, the fundamental issues are, number one, as Helena said, does the technology control you or do you control it? And Zoom is a really interesting example, because I feel like in limited use, like we're using now, Zoom is really useful in doing communication, especially in a planetary emergency. But all of us have had experience now with 8 hours on Zoom, and we're being turned into zombies, right? It's just completely flattening our ability to relate with others and relate with the rest of life. And we need to be conscious of all these secondary and tertiary effects of technology as we embrace them. And I think, again, embracing them selectively. I'll tell you a technology that I don't like, and this was asked in the question, which is, I think cryptocurrencies are crypto theft. And I'll tell you why, because honestly, what we have learned in the rise and fall, well, it hasn't completely fallen, but at least it's led to catastrophe, the financialization of the economy, is we see that all of these derivatives and futures markets and secondary trading things and all these complex trading instruments, the less you understand about your economy and the way in which you are moving your money and embracing certain goods and services, the less likely that you're going to know all of the footnotes associated with this and the way that it could blow up in your face. And honestly, I'm not a dumb guy, but I don't understand most cryptocurrencies. I doubt most of you do either. you may understand the concept of blockchain, which is sort of telling you what are the transactions that preceded it, but what else is it not telling you? I'm telling you, we have to move in the direction of simplifying our economic transactions and making them more transparent so that we can hold each other accountable. And one of the beautiful things about local economies is that they are rooted not in these great abstractions, but in relationships. Relationships between customer and shopkeeper, between investor and local business, between various businesses that might be working together in a supply chain. We want to keep things personal and compassionate.
Thank you. I totally agree. And I'm afraid that people are falling into this propaganda, I would say, that these currencies are somehow more accountable and more democratic. And as you say, no one really understands how it works. And it was years before people understood how much energy is used in Bitcoin. And no one is going to tell me that the cryptocurrencies generally don't use much more energy than we need to do. But above all, it's the lack of visibility and accountability.
All right, I'm going to call on a couple people who have had their hands raised to ask their questions. So let's see if this works. Shivam, could you tell us where you are calling from and what your question is?
Hello, I'm Shivam and I'm in Canada right now, and I'm originally from India. Just to continue from where we left last week, due to a constraint of time, I would again like to say that I understand all the issues that you're raising about the economic systems and the environment degradation that's happening on Earth, and that's affecting all the living and non-living beings. I mean, and it's a sentiment that's shared by a majority of world's population also, and everything in the ecosystem. But I'm still concerned about the idea of going back to localization in the 21st century after over 6 centuries of globalization, which was started, ever since the conquistadors colonized the world. I'm still concerned about that. We could not really find an answer to that to address the problems that can happen. In this world where people, nations are armed with weapons of mass destruction, which ensure mutual destruction of everything. How do you ensure that they are in responsible hands? Localization right now in 21st century can probably lead to ultranationalism, more colonialism in the future, who knows, imperialism, slavery, persecution, xenophobic hatred later on, another world war. We need to think about those issues first and probably then promote this idea. And probably, the perfect solution may not lie in this argument, but we still have to think a lot about the consequences of what we are going to promote and what we have been promoting.
Thank you very much.
And sorry.
Yeah.
And it's not just me who's raising this. There are billions of children like Greta Thunberg who are concerned about this thing. They are sad that activists all over the world are waking up too late to these problems.
Yeah.
And if I could just add that there's a question in the chat that's tied to this, which is, one of the risks that can arise when defending localization is that it can be confused with extreme nationalism, border closing movements, and things like that. So what's the discourse that clearly makes that distinction?
Yeah, well, I definitely want to recommend to you, Shivam, that you read both my book, Ancient Futures, and the new book, Local is Our Future. However, maybe even in Local is Our Future, I may not be stressing enough how we are very clear about the need for international collaboration. And what we're talking about, you've got to distinguish between collaboration and economic subjugation by giants. We're talking about the economic trajectory that, yes, it goes back 500 years actually, of giants subjugating and colonizing and enslaving other places. We are rejecting that economic modus operandi. We're saying, no, we want people to wake up to how that path is what has led to wars. It is that path that created a narrow artificial nationalism by forging an identity that was not there naturally. People identified, first of all, I experienced it very deeply in Ladakh. People identify themselves within the village as belonging to a particular household and piece of land. You know, we are Changpa, and this is from this area. They, outside the village, they identify themselves as part of that village. Outside of that bigger region, again, different levels of identity. The fundamental identity was very secure. People felt happy with who they were. They felt happy with what was. They were confident and so open to diversity and difference. And so, you know, I literally witnessed over a 10-year period how this economic imposition created such intense pressure between local groups that they were killing each other. After 15 years, killing each other in both Bhutan and Ladakh. It's similar to what happened to India because of the colonial imposition, creating centralized competitive structures that didn't give enough room and space and right to a whole range of people's power and identity and ability to provide for themselves. So please don't confuse the economic path of decentralizing power, and not only decentralizing power, but creating the structures necessary to really understand the complex, rich world on which we depend. By going down this centralizing economic path, we become blind and stupid, and the further we go, the more we go into the eye of technology, the more we go into an eye of blind, of what I call a drone economy, where you can sit in New York and very effectively order the clear cutting of a forest on the other side of the world. But in no way can you actually contribute to the creation of a flourishing forest instead of a monocultural plantation. That takes people on the ground, that takes eye. So on the other side, as I said earlier, we desperately need genuine collaboration. We desperately need now people who are able to, to step back, to have understood that allowing global banks and global corporations to sit around a table with our governments and determine the language of the climate treaties so that they can continue trading and getting richer, reducing everything to carbon, a tradable commodity. That's a corporate brainchild coming not from evil people, but from an institution that is all prime. It's a sick institution. The global corporation is an institution that has as its reason for existence pure profit. And we can talk about ethical, we can talk about, a shift, but really it's the structure that has to change. So I hope this makes sense, but there's a lot more to say.
Yeah,
and Michael maybe wants to say something else.
So the one thing I would add to this is localization is most of our economies right now. We just don't acknowledge it. In the United States, depending on how you define the word local for local businesses are responsible for between 60 and 80% of our economy by jobs and by output. And every other country that I've looked at, like Australia and Canada and the UK and Germany, they all have higher degrees of localization than the United States does. So I would rephrase your question and say, not how is it that we can drag people kicking and screaming from globalization back to an old concept of localization. The question is, how do we stop the unnatural process of globalization, which has been dragging us away from the most of our economy that we know how to work, which is localization? And the answer is you stop subsidizing the global competition. Because when you subsidize global companies, of course, they're going to begin to make inroads against your local business and local economic integrity. That's why where you invest your money and how you do your purchasing is so important.
I agree with you, like, and I understand what you're saying, but maybe the solution may lie somewhere between globalization and localization, a mixture of both of these, because there are a lot of arguments which support the benefits of globalization that has happened for the masses, majority of world's people. You know, it has in a lot of ways eradicated the problems of middlemen, traders.
But you're not, let's just be clear, Shiva, you're not advocating subsidizing global companies. You believe that in a free competition, we may have a role for some global companies, right?
See, it has to be like a mixture, you know, like there have to be like some global
But is it a
companies.
mixture that's driven by subsidy, as has been the case?
No,
or is it a mixture that's driven by the market?
Definitely, I don't you know, like agree with the subsidizing thing, because you know, like when people don't value things, they waste those resources. So I don't agree with subsidization.
Good.
But
that's what we're saying. We're saying that right now governments are subsidizing global business, and usually those global businesses pay almost no tax. Those same businesses are also being deregulated. At the local and national level, every business is being squeezed for taxes and heavily regulated. So we have this completely unfair playing field.
I understand that.
Yeah, and I actually believe, Michael, that in order to avoid that blackmailing, we basically would need to argue that every business belonged to a nation state. But that doesn't end global trade. It doesn't end global collaboration between two businesses, an American business and an Indian business. And it doesn't end in any way the collaboration between the two governments to collaborate, to protect the environment, to prevent war, to ensure that there is both environmental and social protection. So I think
we should probably move on to another question. This conversation could definitely continue.
I would love to like talk more about it. I'm like it's just like shortage of time. But
yeah, and again, just if you join the International Alliance for Localization, we've got an active Facebook group where you can pose these questions, and we'll respond.
Just last one more point I want to like raise, and I was saying that globalization has eradicated the problem of middlemen traders who were exploiting the farmers as well as the consumers. They were extracting their like harvest at very low prices, and if you need to like just study history of countries, you know, and you'll understand what the problem was. And the problem was same for consumers as well. They were paying higher prices, and it was like the middlemen who always used to make the money. So that problem is still not getting addressed through localization. And I just urge everyone.
We actually think it is Shivam, and I think now it would be good if you could get into the IAL, and I hope you'll join us for more webinars. And
we'll continue this conversation.
And I just urge all the activists to have some compassion and empathy while finding out solutions, which are like the foremost values of Buddhism also. I mean, like there should be solutions which are in interest of every living and non-living being on earth, and you know it has to come with compassion and empathy. You know, I mean,
that's
if we
true.
just like
Shivam, if you don't mind, I think we really need to move to the next question. I'm sorry, but please post your thoughts in our Facebook group, and we'll continue the conversation there. Just a lot of other people have asked good questions, and I'm gonna bring some of them in now. So I'll read this question from Juliet from Oregon. This is from Michael. Can you talk about steady state economics and if you see this approach as being relevant to our future? And if so, do you see any transitional approaches around this?
Yeah, I think steady state economics is very important to our future. And, you know, there's two ways of thinking about economic growth. The conventional way sort of tallies everything the same and thereby gives credit, equal credit to energy consuming activities that generate more GDP, gross domestic product. But I think it's possible to think about growth not in goods and services per se, but in doing things better, more efficiently, doing things that are more aesthetically pleasing, artistic kinds of advances. So if one defines growth without more material and more energy, it's possible that we could have a kind of a growth that was consistent with the kind of world we want. But I think either way you define it, it's closer to a steady state kind of economy.
I would also just very quickly like to add that we really need, again, this very fundamental message that the real economy is the earth. Everything we use comes from the earth. And fundamental is the understanding that smaller scale, highly diversified farms, forests, and support of smaller scale fisheries is how we can increase wealth. We can grow the real economy. Right now, the path we're on, techno-intensive, energy-intensive, giantesque, means monoculture everywhere. Monoculture is deadly. It's deadly, it's destroying the soil. It is less productive. You can never, ever produce more unless you have artificial subsidies for more water or something, but you have the same conditions. And if you plant diversity on one bit of land and monoculture on the other, you'll always be able to get more out of the land. So there is a growth we're welcoming in the real economy. And that also, the real economy includes a number of jobs. We want a job-rich economy. So right now, we're actually looking at a growth path, which means more businesses fulfilling the same function, not one giant global, but lots of small and medium-sized. So a growth in the number of businesses, a growth in the number of jobs, and a growth in the real economy.
All right, thank you. Let's see. This question is from Kaoru. I'm sorry, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but question is, what is the role of education, and particularly higher education, in making the shift to localization?
Well, I mean, from our experience, and we have colleagues who've written books about it, there's been a frightening shift in higher education towards narrowing towards a type of science and technology that suits the globalizing path. In the business sector, it's been full embrace of transnationals as the way forward. I remember seeing a book in economics, this already happened 20 years ago, I saw it in France, that was saying, it used to be that governments saw transnational corporations as a problem. Now they realize that collaborating with them is the way forward. So there's been a shaping of the agenda, of the actual curriculum, to suit the needs of giant global corporations, and the technologies that suit this extractive type of growth that is to the detriment truly of the 99%. So that's where we need change. We need to start looking at what kinds of businesses do we want? What do we want people to know for that? At the very local level, and I know it can sound very too local and too traditional, but we're seeing this really lovely trend, like in the eco-villages, the permaculture, that also could be implemented in the so-called third world very rapidly, where people are learning how to build houses, they're learning how to grow food, they're learning how to make things, they're learning how to make baskets, they're also having time to learn to play some music. It's a path that allows for the creation of multiple skills, the learning of multiple skills, and it's very, very enjoyable. Now, there is another, as it were, real world agenda where everybody can't start doing that. And if you live in the heart of the big cities, we need also to look at a direction and an evolution, but it's certainly going to be, the mandate is going to be, let's use less energy. Let's not go with a type of Green New Deal that thinks that we can produce endless amounts of renewable energy to fuel the global trading system. We don't want that. We want job-rich, ecological economies, and let's change the curriculum at the university. It's beginning to happen. There's a small college in America called Sterling College. There's small lots all over doing things that are in that direction, and very exciting.
Yeah, and I'll just say, you know, that I teach for a business program, Bard College, and all of my students learn about localization, and I encourage them, help them get into careers to build the local economy. I think there needs to be more business schools like this, but it's beginning to happen. So I'm cautiously optimistic that maybe the academy will come around.
I want to make sure we get to, oh, sorry.
I would say also that actually, yes, in, you know, with the schooling, as I talked earlier, or even at the university level, what's so heartening is with the big picture activism, when you start paying attention, you'll see that there are so many more positive trends than you realize. So much more happening, and all the time it's testimony to people's fundamental common sense, wisdom, and caring. Because it's all happening with less money, less support, not visible in the mainstream media, mainstream academia, but everywhere people are showing they want something more human, something more ecological, something more meaningful, something that makes them happier, the economics of happiness.
All right, thank you, Helena. And Karen, I see your hand is raised, but I'm having some trouble with the allow to talk feature here. That says you're using an older version of Zoom. So if you wouldn't mind writing your question, that would be fantastic. And we've got a few minutes left, so we'll try and get to it. But for now, I'll ask, several people have asked in the chat, what's a recommendation for a simple thing, or maybe a not so simple thing that you could do, that people could do right now as individuals, besides being a responsible consumer and spreading information about localization?
Right. So I'll just, I typed this in the chat, but there were some follow-on questions, which is, I think we should all adopt our favorite local business. And one of the things we should do in that adoption is, during this period of crisis, offer to buy a year's worth of whatever we get from that business in advance. And I think that business would be happy to give us even a discount, but by putting some of that resource into their hands right now, it's going to really help increase the probability of that business surviving. I'll say that I noticed that on this discussion, my friend Judy Wicks from Philadelphia has been listening in, and Judy has been organizing her buddies in Philadelphia to do this with a bunch of local businesses there, and kudos for this concept.
I didn't know Judy was there. That's wonderful. Yeah, we are, you know, we sort of trying to urge people to go in two directions, the sort of creation of the local systems, and we do see them a bit as lifeboats in case our governments don't wake up and start changing things. And so we do see food as absolutely the foundation of a healthier economy. And it's the area that has been trampled on and been made into a shadow economy. It's what I often say, you know, the most important things we do, parenting and growing food, both, you know, mothers and farmers have been made into shadows, and they don't count in the whole GDP trajectory. So in the, too much to say, but anyway, food has been trampled on. We've been moving on a path where we produce less per acre than we could, and it's the most central. It's the only thing we produce that everybody needs every day of their life. So shifting the food economy needs a huge amount of help. So I would urge people to focus on that, to support those businesses in the way Michael was saying would be very good. Get together perhaps with a group where together you see if you can start a community garden or help to start a farmer's market or support the existing local producers as a priority. And that can involve setting up a local fund to again support the growing of food in your region, diversifying, growing to create that foundation that is absolutely essential.
Thanks so much to both of you. We're out of time right now, and apologies to everyone whose questions we didn't get to. There were some really good ones, and I hope that all of you who did not have your questions answered here will join the International Alliance for Localization. If you go to localfutures.org and under our projects in the menu, you'll find a link to the page about the International Alliance for Localization. Sign up. We've got an active Facebook group and listserv, and you can ask your question there, and not only we will respond to you, but lots of other people from within the localization circle will have a chance to share their thoughts. So
I would also like to remind people, I think I said it earlier, that on June 21st, we're planning a big web-based event on localization, and we really hope that you'll help to get the word out and that you'll join us for that, June 21st.
Absolutely.
All right. Have a good evening, all. Take care.
Thank you, you too.
Michael. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Sean.